Well, welcome to the 700 Club. Catastrophe in Syria as Turkish war crimes mount. Kurdish leaders executed. Thousands of civilians running for their lives. And now a deal with Syria's Assad brings Russia into the mix. CBN reporters are in the region. Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell begins our coverage. Chris?
Turkish forces continued their offensive along a wide area of the Turkish-Syrian border. U.S. officials said the scope of the invasion is larger than they were told. The Turkish invasion is spearheaded by jihadist troops called the Free Syrian Army. They've already committed atrocities, including the execution of these Kurdish soldiers seen in this shocking video and the murder of a prominent Kurdish politician. These jihadists shouted they came to free ISIS prisoners, and hundreds of ISIS supporters have already escaped, including those seen in this video. Some warn the pullout of the U.S. presence will reignite the war against ISIS. All this comes as President Trump ordered the pullout of 1,000 troops from northeast Syria, a move criticized by many of his supporters.
Leaving an ally behind, abandoning people that we frankly told that we were going to be with. Is disheartening, depressing. Frankly, it's weak.
Yet current Defense Secretary Mark Esper said the U.S. wasn't able to stop Turkey.
Turkey committed this action. They decided to make an incursion in northern Syria, despite our protestations, our urgings not to do it.
But many accuse the president of abandoning the U.S.'s #1 ally in the battle against ISIS. The SDF says since the U.S. wouldn't stand with them, they had no choice but to turn to Syrian President Bashar Assad and Russia. Syrian troops are already on their way to the strategic town of Kobani. Syrians celebrated this new alliance, but for the SDF, it was a bitter pill. Yet their choice was either Turkish genocide or submit to an authoritarian government. It also means Syria's ally, Iran, is waiting in the wings to come in. In the meantime, the fighting has left hundreds of thousands of people displaced. This woman said, "I have 4 children, 2 girls and 2 boys. Where should I go? Where can I go to escape the shelling? Just tell me, Europeans and Arabs, just tell me where to go with my children." In the Kurdish homeland in northern Iraq, aid agencies are preparing to help the refugees. CBN News senior international correspondent George Thomas reports from Erbil.
This is George Thomas in Iraq's Kurdistan region. Since Turkey's invasion of northeast Syria last Wednesday, hundreds of Kurds have staged daily protests in front of the UN building here in Erbil. To protect the compound, Kurdish authorities deployed military personnel and riot police around the facility. Also demonstrating against Turkey's military operation are Syrian refugees who have loved ones fleeing the conflict area.
I'm so sad about what's happening in my country. To see the images on the TV is very heartbreaking for me.
They carried posters depicting Turkey's President Erdogan as a terrorist and an ISIS fighter. With the news that Syria and Russia could now get into the fight, many here fear a dramatic escalation and are pleading with the international community, especially the United States, to stop Turkey's operation against the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces.
The U.S. says it stands for human rights and freedom, but where is that for the Syrians who are suffering? My message to President Trump is, please reverse your decision to pull your troops out and allow Turkey to invade. Come up with any other options, but not this one. This is the worst idea because now people in northeast Syria are suffering.
Across town from the protests, Kurdistan's largest local NGO, Barzani Charity Foundation, is getting ready to care for the tens of thousands of Syrian refugees who could potentially come streaming out of Syria and into this part of Iraq.
These displaced people will need food, hygiene kits, milk for the children, blankets, and other supplies because most fled with little of their possessions in hand.
Operation Blessing will be helping Barzani Charity Foundation prepare some of the essential aid kits.
This is an important partnership. We have worked together in the past to help protect the lives of the people in the region. So I'm always happy when dear brothers who care for us want to help us again.
Turkey's push deeper into Syria could make matters even worse. The UN says more than 100,000 civilians have already been displaced since last Wednesday's invasion. George Thomas, CBN News, Erbil, Iraq.
Well, CBN Middle East Bureau Chief Chris Mitchell joins us now from Jerusalem. Chris, the people you talked to already set a signal that they were desperate and they had to call on Assad to help them. This, of course, brings the Russians in. What is your understanding?
Well, that's exactly right, Pat. And it's also a very fluid situation. As you mentioned, the Russians are actually going to have a no-fly zone over this Turkish-Syrian border. That's something the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, had asked for days that the United States would do. But right now, we understand that the Syrian forces, the Syrian army, is deployed along the Turkish-Syrian border, except where the fighting is going on. And they're working with the SDF right now. And the other thing, Pat, that I've just been hearing just in the last hour or so is that right now it seems that the United States is still deployed in eastern Syria. Now, that could be very important. If the United States does at least stay there, then I think it would prevent some perhaps Iranian influence coming in to that part of Syria.
What is Erdogan doing? What exactly? We understand that he's violated every single sanction or any agreement he's made. Is that right?
Exactly. He had agreed to not create a humanitarian disaster. We're seeing maybe 200,000 people right now displaced. He had said that he would protect Christians and religious minorities. We know that Christians have fled for their lives. That Christians have been killed. We know that he was supposed to protect civilians. Civilians have been indiscriminately bombed in this place. And so really, you know, Pat, I think people need to understand what Erdogan's real goals was ethnic cleansing along this whole border. And he wanted, and he said it openly there in the United Nations, that he wanted 1 to 2 million Arab Syrian refugees to replace that area. He had done it in Afrin back in March of 2018, something that the world really had ignored, and he wanted to do that here. And one other thing, Pat, I think it's important to remember that it's coming out information that back in August, the United States, the SDF, and Turkey had an agreement along that line that they would protect, they would have some sort of joint patrols. Part of that agreement was that the SDF would pull back its seasoned troops, destroy defenses, take back its heavy weapons, and yet the U.S. pulled out of that agreement. And one SDF person said that their chests were laid bare to the Turkish knives. And so that's some of the backstory of what happened with the United States agreement that was never kept with the SDF.
Chris, look, how does the U.S. stand now in the Middle East? What is our fallout for our country?
You know, that's one of the major fallouts of this whole thing, Pat, is that the word of the United States has been diminished. If they're going to leave a U.S. ally, the #1 ally in the battle against ISIS, and then turn their backs on them, you have to wonder that all the other allies in the region are going to suspect what the U.S. word can mean. It can embolden U.S. adversaries, Russia, the Syrian regime, or Iran, and think that the United States will be weak when they protect their allies. One key area, Pat, I think people need to realize is the KRG, actually the place where George just reported on. This is the Kurdish regional government. They're in the balance right now. They're looking to the U.S. Is the U.S. going to stand with them, or are they going to have to look to Iran? And that could have serious consequences throughout the Middle East and actually for Israel as well.
Well, let's talk about Israel. This obviously is threatening Israel because it brings their enemies right up on the border.
Exactly. And, you know, we have talked about this many times, that the Iranian regime wants to build a land bridge all the way from Tehran to the Mediterranean. If this can decrease the U.S. influence increase Iran's influence. Now, as I talked about the KRG, for example, if they're going to side with Iran, that just makes that land bridge that much stronger and makes Iran's goal to destroy Israel that much more immediate. And so I think people here, the Israeli government, today is the first day of Sukkot, the first Feast of Tabernacles, so we haven't seen any official word yet, but I'm sure, Pat, that they're looking very soberly at what the United States has done with their allies, the SDF, there in northeast Syria, and what that consequences may mean for them, and as well as all the U.S. allies in the Middle East.
Is there any stopping Erdogan? He can do what he wants to now. Is that what you are hearing?
Well, actually, Pat, I think right now the Syrian army is actually acting like a buffer to Erdogan. And I think this is a very precarious position for Erdogan. He might have bitten off more than he can chew. He's actually, ironically, asking NATO to come and help him against the, quote, terrorists. But I think he's really broken relationship with many of his European allies. And I think many of those would rather see Turkey out of NATO than in NATO right now. So right now, as I said, it's a very fluid situation. But I think we can say the Syrian army deploying along the border right now is somehow containing this Turkish invasion. There is fighting going on in several areas, but right now I think we can say that it's a precarious situation because we don't know if Turkey's going to fire on the Syrian army. We don't know if the Syrian army is going to fight on them. So it's very uncertain right now, but at least possibly this could be containing the Turkish invasion against northeast Syria.
Chris, thank you very much. Chris Mitchell, ladies and gentlemen, reporting from the Middle East. We talk about NATO. I've asked our staff to check about it. There's no mechanism to kick a member out of NATO. They don't have such a mechanism. And what we have to do, Lindsey Graham is trying to get harsh sanctions against Turkey, but is he going to suspend the NATO involvement? If one NATO member is attacked, the others are supposed to help him. And what happens in a situation like that? This, again, is very confusing. And we'll be talking to Lindsey Graham in a couple of days about what he's planning. He's talking about harsh sanctions. I'm not sure sanctions would deter Erdogan from anything, but this is a bloodbath that unfortunately was not foreseen. Maybe it should have been, but it wasn't foreseen. This is a precipitate action which has led to chaos. And the idea that we're taking our troops out, well, that's just great. But there you're sending 2,000 more troops out into Saudi Arabia, and at least 1,000 of those ISIS fighters are now joining ISIS again, and they'll be out there to kill our people when they come back. And Baghdadi, the head of ISIS, is rubbing his hands with glee because the coast is now clear for him to reconstitute the caliphate that he wanted to build in the Middle East. It is chaos, ladies and gentlemen, and many people are suffering.